Debate over gain-of-function research, the type of research that is at the heart of the lab leak story, at least potentially, has reignited since the Department of Energy said that this is the likely origin of the COVID-19 pandemic, a escape from a lab. Now, National Security Council spokesman John Kirby had this to say about President Biden's continued support of funding for gain-of-function research.
Does the president believe that this type of gain-of-function research is proven?
He believes that it's important to help prevent future pandemics, which means he understands that there has to be legitimate scientific research into the sources or potential sources of pandemics so that we understand it, so that we can prevent them, and we can prevent them from happening, obviously. But he also believes, and this is why he wants the whole of government effort here to understand it, that research has to be done, it must be done in a safe and secure manner and as transparent as possible to the rest of the world so people know what's going on. So I think that's a fancy way of saying yes.
Meanwhile, Senator Rand Paul told Real Clear Politics White House report Philip Wegman, quote, "If we have learned anything from this pandemic, it's that risky virus-enhancing research, like the type conducted in Wuhan that was funded by the U.S. government, needs more oversight and regulation." He joins us now to discuss. Welcome, Philip.
Thanks for having me.
So this is an interesting kind of trade-off that's being raised here. It's being framed as, should we do gain-of-function research versus should we not do gain-of-function research? Is that the right question? Is it possible to do gain-of-function research safely at all?
That's a question that the previous administrations took up before a once-in-a-century pandemic and before there was a lot of debate, much of it very emotional, about whether or not there were some things that should be out of bounds. So if you ignore all of the context, something that normally you shouldn't do in news, but if you ignore the last 3 years, including that pandemic that killed more than 1 million Americans, this story is just one about how the Biden administration is considering whether or not there should be new regulations on a type of research that the Obama administration put a taxpayer-funded moratorium on, and that the Trump administration then lifted 3 years later. Setting aside, all of the controversy that we've seen, this is still a fierce debate that is happening among scientists currently. And then when you look at all of the context, of course, it becomes that much more charged. I think that what the administration is doing is they're trying to be forthright and say, we think that there is some merit to this type of analysis, but we want significant safeguards.
So this is all happening, with the context of the Department of Energy coming out and saying that they're now in the direction of thinking it was a lab leak. They're expressing that with low confidence. Obviously, it's not the final word on the subject. No one should say it's conclusively been determined or something like that. But there was a lot of media reporting in the last 48 hours on lab leak theory. This issue is getting more mainstream attention than it's ever gotten. And previously, when it was getting mainstream attention, it was being derided as something only like conspiracy theorists were buying into. So I think it's great to be putting these kinds of questions to actual, government figures. What did you make of Kirby's response to you? And do you sense any shifting in the government's willingness to indulge in lab leak speculation, which was something they were willing to do to some degree before? It was really the media that was trying to clap down on it. But is it shifting at all?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that the administration, this is not something that came out of the blue. The NIH empowered an advisory board on biosecurity at the National Science Association to take a closer look at what type of new regulations should be put in place for scientists here in the United States doing this type of research. And now, as the New York Times previously reported, that decision rests with the White House. What we heard from Kirby on Tuesday was a pretty forthright explanation of where their head is. They think that there are some advantages to doing research on pandemics, making some of these pathogens more dangerous so that you can get ahead of a catastrophe and plan for it. But there has to be safeguards put in place. I think his phrase was that it had to be safe, secure, and transparent. I'm not sure that the public is going to have an appetite for that type of scientific inquiry. But what I do appreciate is that the administration, that they gave a straight answer of where the president's thinking is on this question, and rather than the media all just running to deride anyone who asks these sort of questions, there seems to be some reasoned analysis here, and I think that that is the most significant change from what we saw over the last 3 years.
Yeah, the irony is that the kind of media shutdown of any conversations about lab leak theory took the conversation from a place where it could have been about how do we address the fact that there were warning signs. There was this 2018 report that there were safety issues at the Wuhan lab. How can we, instead of focusing the problem on all of the warning signs that could have been addressed and the problems that could have made the process safer so that potentially useful research could have persisted, it instead became a conversation about how it's all or nothing. I think it's a much more black and white conversation than it would have been otherwise, which it's not clear to me. If I'm not a scientist, I don't know if this kind of research is ultimately more beneficial than it is harmful. But given how many tension points there were, or error points there were that could have been corrected, it seems a shame to be in a position where we could potentially be throwing out the baby with the bathwater prematurely without having a robust conversation if there are, in fact, safety protocols that could have been put in place. I remember there was reporting about how people even who visited the labs observed that they're basically tiered hierarchies of protections or safety measures at different kinds of labs, depending on how dangerous the materials they're working with are. And there was a clear mismatch with the gain of function research and the quality and level of the labs. We all know that there's like the last Black Death virus or whatever, all of these extinct viruses they keep up in Antarctica somewhere. You can imagine some really uber safety protocols that could go into place if it really was scientifically beneficial to do research on these things. Because again, you can imagine a world in which there's a pandemic that comes down the pike that we've done no research on, and people are complaining that the scientists were wrong to not have tried to get ahead of that and to not have started to do the kind of research that could make a vaccine come more quickly. So, I don't know what your impression is speaking to some of these officials firsthand, Philip, but do you get the impression that there is at all any appetite for fixing the problem as opposed to pivoting to a shutdown of this kind of research altogether?
I think that what we're seeing is a pivot back to the Obama era square one here, because the Obama administration looks at the risks, weighs them against potential rewards, and says, wait a minute, we don't want taxpayer funding going to this type of risky research. And that was the moratorium that was put in place in 2014. Then in 2017, it's the Trump administration that lifts that moratorium. And I think that what is beginning now, and what hopefully we'll learn more about in the coming weeks and months ahead, is whether or not the scientific community, as well as some of these government agencies, are able to have a reasoned discussion and really focus on whether or not it is prudent to do this type of research without a lot of the moral panic that we saw previously. Because just as it is possible to say, hey, there are some benefits to this type of inquiry, it's also, we have seen things that up until recently were more likely to be dismissed. For instance, the Office of Inspector General's letter from HHS saying that NIH overlooked some red flags with EcoHealth Alliance, that they didn't do due diligence there. So the hope, I think, ought to be that you get all of these smart people in the room and you say, all right, is this something that we actually need? Or are you just, a scientist who is excited to get your hands on, old bubonic plague samples because of some strange, academic fascination? Or is this something that we actually could use, heaven helping, to prevent another once in a century.
Don't give him any ideas, Phil.
It's all that scene from Jurassic Park, right?
Yep. Yes, it is.
Scientists were too focused on whether or not they could to ask if they should.
Dr. Frankenstein's all the way down. Thank you so much for joining us today. Philip Wegman, we appreciate it. And we'll have more Rising right after this.